that. So I wanted to give thanks to the College Curriculum Council for their help in putting these together. Usually we call on some of our teaching award winners to present at the Master Teaching Lunches, and so we've got some at least two already set up for this next semester. But sometimes also we do a few different things, invite other people, and this semester Laura Walker approached me about potentially having a panel session and looking at how we can help address issues in the classroom that come up. Sometimes they're difficult issues. And so we have a great panel set up for us, and I want to go ahead and turn that over to them, and they can introduce each other and get us started. So pass the baton.
So Laura asked if I would kind of help moderate this. So I think I'll just we can kind of just go in order of the way we were listed. So David, do you want to start by introducing yourself?
Sure.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, David James Gonzalez, assistant professor in history, and been here for a couple of years at BYU. My specialty is in race and ethnicity in U.S. history, more specifically immigration and Latino politics.
Jacob.
Hi, Jacob Rue in sociology. I've been at BYU since 2012. I teach a lot of GE classes that have to do with sociology, race, ethnicity, immigration, urban sociology as well sometimes. So when I talk today, I'll be talking mainly about teaching students that are not sociology majors, students from a broad array of majors. And that's about all you need to know about me right now. Thanks so much, Carrie.
You bet. Thanks, Jacob. Okay, Sharina.
Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Sharina Sassa in the School of Social Work. I've been here for about 2.5 years, not as long as Jake over there. But yeah, so with the social work program, we have a graduate program. So most of the classes I teach are for grad students. And obviously with social work, we're looking at all the issues in the social context that cause problems in living. So that touches a lot of some of the controversial topics that come up. I think that's about it.
Thanks, Sharina. I'm sure there's a lot more you could say, but that's good for today. So I'm Carrie O'Grady. I'm a visiting associate professor in the psychology department. So I have been teaching topics of diversity, so multicultural psychology and diversity in counseling for the last, I guess, about 10 years. 12 years, and I serve on the American Psychological Association as an advisor to the Chief Diversity Officer, and also serve as our current new co-chair with Dawn Marie on our own diversity committee, and we've started a student committee that we're pretty excited about. I'm also the division president for the American Psychological Association, the division president of the Society for the Psychology of Religion and Spirituality. So I think and my research focuses on studying diverse populations around the world and seeing what causes or doesn't resilience from an individual and within a community perspective. So let's go ahead and get started by having David, do you want to just share? We're going to each take just maybe 2-3 minutes, give a couple points, and then we're going to turn it over for questions and conversations with the panel members. So go ahead, David.
Great. So thanks for this opportunity. Just a few quick things. I think the first thing I want to address is that having open dialogue and providing the space, creating the space, to have discussions even about challenging topics is crucial. I feel strongly about this, particularly in the university and in our classrooms, that if we don't take the charge to do that in these spaces, our students aren't going to get this anywhere else, right? They're not going to get it in the workplace. They're not going to get it at church. I mean, I frankly avoid any type of tough conversations at church because I love my neighbors and I just don't want to go there, right? But yeah, so I think that's the first point I want to make, that our classrooms are the vital space. And it does take a lot of effort to create the space and an environment, but it is badly and desperately needed. A couple suggestions in preparing for this, how to create and maintain a respectful class environment, is to start off by setting the tone early on day one and continuing to emphasize that it's important for you and in that classroom to have open dialogue and to encourage students to participate and to ask questions, even if they're hesitant. I know it's not easy to do that, and it takes a lot more than just saying it and restating it. But that type of openness and willingness to say that you want to learn from them, you're willing to take questions and have these discussions, even if they take away from classroom time, even if that means you have to not get to something you scheduled to do today, maybe you have to do it later, etc. That it's important for you to have these type of conversations. Another issue is to plan. Plan to have them. Look through your schedule. Look through your syllabus. See where you can address important topics that are going on, in our country, in our world. I mean, I teach U.S. history, right? So it's really easier, I would say, for me to do this because it may so than, I don't know, in biology or some of the STEM fields. But so one way I do that is I design my class. I design my class around important issues, important perspectives, diversity perspectives. Teaching U.S. history, you can't do that without addressing race, class, gender, politics, etc. So I'm very open from the beginning that this is how I design my classes, and that that this is an integral part of what we do in the class. The next thing I'll suggest is that while I am the expert, right, in my classroom, obviously I have training, I have expertise. I do let my students know that there's limitations to what I know, or at least there's limitations in how I understand what I do. And that is shaped by my social background. That is shaped by my race, my ethnicity, the class that I grew up in, the church I grew up in, the education that I have, etc. So, and I know that can be complicated for faculty of color and for women particularly. There's a limit to showing vulnerability, but I think that it is important to show that we all have our limitations, and that we can do that while still maintaining that, I am the expert in the room on the issue to some extent, right? And this last thing I just want to bring up to get things started is that it's important that we know our audience. We know our students. I came to BYU with a lot of preconceived notions and stereotypical views about what our student body would be, and a lot of those have been exploded. They've been blown up as I've gotten to know my students, and I've just loved learning from them. And I truly believe we have a diverse community that maybe on face value a lot don't give us credit for or take credit for, but as we get to know our students and we learn particularly that they have questions and concerns that may limit how open they feel to contributing in the classroom, that it's important for us to be aware of that and to try to make sure that we're paying attention to those type of concerns that they may have. So I have some ideas about how to do that, but I'll leave it for now.
Thanks, David. That was great. Jake.
All right, thanks so much, DJ. I've learned a lot from you. I've got 3 quick points. I think it'll take about 5-6 minutes max. Point number 1, unbelievably, it says in bold here, set the tone and example early, which is exactly what DJ talked about, but I have different content to that, don't worry. And then point number 2 is I devote personally most of my time and energy to students that are willing to listen and learn, which is always over 90% of my students. And then point number 3 is most people respond to carrots or positive incentives, but some people do need a stick or a negative incentive, some of the very few. So those are the 3 points. So point number 1, I'm gonna spend the most time on. First day, first week, absolutely critical. Have a core philosophy about your teaching that is tied to your integrity as a messenger of your discipline. I'll give you an example in a moment. And also that is tied to gospel truth. So one of my mentors, I've had many mentors, Renata Forsti, who's the director of the Kennedy Center, has a triangle that has agency, biology, and society, that all 3 things influence us. No one thing determines everything. Everything's complex and in the middle. But if you deny the influence of any one of those three things, right, you're not pursuing truth. And our students are pretty well versed, those who are LDS and of Christian faith, of thinking about agency and biology, spirit and body, but they don't think as much about society unless, as DJ mentioned, right, if they're a member of a marginalized group, they've been reminded of the influence of society on a daily basis. So that's something that's tied into how I teach, tied into the gospel. I bring in scripture verses, right on day one. Just one example. I give students a very honest, real preview. I always assign readings the first day. We come straight out of the gate. I share my story. I model vulnerability. And one of the things I do with my stories, I talk a lot about Black and Latino people that have taught me as teachers, coaches, role models, leaders, so that they know that if they are, let's say, not from the dominant group, you know, maybe they're a woman, maybe they're a person of color, what have you, first-gen student, I'm modeling to them that I've actually valued what they have to say because it has brought me to this point in my life, right? So it's not hollow, okay? I invite people who are not ready, who are not on board, to drop the class, to drop it the first day or drop it the second day or drop it the third day before the add drop deadline. I'm very explicit about that. I say this fulfills this GE requirement. You can take another professor. You can take another section. Almost everybody is legally an adult. I was 17 when I started BYU, so I'm pretty sensitive to that. But everybody can make their own choice, right? Nobody is forced. Everybody has their agency, right? So that's that, okay? Another thing is I say, always address me as either Dr. Rue or Professor Rue. I always make a joke that I say Dr. Rue because it's a lot faster to type in an email, right? That's the only reason why I have doctor instead of professor. And I make a really important point that I'm going by that title so that they can refer to the women professors by the same title. And I talk about my mom, who got her University of Chicago degree, and then people called her Sister Rue at BYU. She said, I did not spend this much money in 7 years of my life to be called Sister Rue, right? I don't always talk about that example, but that's just an example. So the very first week, I try to model some of the things that DJ brought up, and I'm glad we can reinforce one another's points. We have tough discussions on the first day about racism in the church, about things like Charlottesville, other things on the very first day of class. And that serves as a little bit as a trial balloon, right? How did that go the first day? How were people ready? Some people, you know, are self-selected, they're ready to go. Some people aren't. You can start to detect things pretty early on that first week, and that can really help you as a professor, okay? So one thing, just brief example, there's no evidence whatsoever in my discipline in the peer-reviewed literature for reverse racism, right? That's not a thing. And I can supply data and I give students empirical data on that, right? So I have to have integrity. I tell the students, I can't present both sides of that issue because there is no other side in my discipline. That might exist on cable TV or in your world, but that side doesn't exist in my discipline. And this is a SOC listed class. Feel free to take another class listed in any other subject matter, right? But that's not a thing, right? And plus, there's the church statement we study on the first day about how white supremacy and a white culture agenda are not in harmony with the gospel. And that's almost an exact quote. And so that's very specific, right, about white supremacy being the problem, not, you know, somehow telling a bad joke about somebody else or something like that. So it's also a moral issue, right? There's no empirical evidence, and it's also a moral issue. So that leads to the last point here on point number 1, is that I always discuss the difference between objective and neutral. I've mentored a few faculty, several that are women, who use that effectively as well, just saying, I'm going to use objective methods, objective data, but on questions like racism, I'm not going to remain neutral, and I never will. I'm never going to present it as a this side, that side thing, right? And then I also say that, hey, there'll be other things when we study undocumented immigration, where there's more gray area, where it's more difficult, right? We need to tease these things out. What DJ talked about, emphasize the limitations of our own knowledge, right? Where we need to see more data, right? And then interpret the data, right? Using the principles as a moral lens. So I try to get to that really early on. And like DJ said, here in college should be different. It should be this experience that's amazing, where people look back. My wife talks about this all the time. She's like, oh, I got a master's degree at Columbia. I want to go back and get a PhD. I just love those great discussions, right? She's a social worker by training. She absolutely loves that, We want college to be that space, especially BYU, where we can bring in faith and reason. They can reinforce one another. Okay, last 2 points are really quick. I think I'm doing well. I devote most of my time and energy to students that are going to listen and learn, and I try to teach in a way that shows them and invites them to join us, right, in our righteous cause. But that means they're going to go out and do XYZ professions, ABC things, many different spheres and roles. I want them to go forth and serve, right, like it says there on the way to human halls, but do it in a way that inspires them to join us, right? Also, there's this new wonderful statement by the College of Family, Home, and Social Sciences that many here in the DCI initiative with Associate Dean Walker and Dean Ogles and many others have put together. So that new statement, I haven't been teaching this semester, but next semester will be my first time. I will read that in class. It's all heavily sourced by church statements. So that's really, really important, okay? So when it comes to teaching to the students that are willing to listen, we do a lot of experiential learning. They have a project, they have an action-based thing, tons of digital dialogues. I have tons of quiet writing reflections. I'm always taking their temperature to figure out where are people. Because a lot of people, I have 5 children, some are very shy and don't talk, and teachers think they're not as intelligent, and we know they just as are, and I have others that will talk your head off, right? And the students are the same way. Some of them will not say things, but they will write things that are really, really important, and that helps give you a temperature. Okay, last point. This is the pointer that I think some of the young faculty are looking for, right? Carefully crafted syllabus statement. I have colleagues who are on this Zoom meeting right now who have better statements than mine, and I've used some of their language with their permission, of course. Have a statement that's specific, that talks about what penalties are imposed for hijacking in class, disrespecting other, and all these things tie into the gospel and the honor code specifically, right? And be sure to make that clear without spending as much time on that, right, and energy. But make that clear that disruptive students will lose a lot of points, and it could cost them a lot of their grade, right? There are some people that need that negative incentive. So I will stop right there and thank the others for their edification and knowledge. Thank you, Carrie.
Thanks, Jake. So DJ, it sounds like I've been referring to you as David when you go by DJ, so I apologize for that. And I look forward to getting to know you better, so that would be more obvious to me. So Sharina, do you have a few words to share with us?
Yeah, so the joy of coming in third is like they've said all the key things. I was looking at my list, I'm like, I think we're done here. How's a quick lunch? Okay, so just overall, so I'll just mention the 3 points that as I was thinking today, that I found very helpful in trying to maintain this respectful environment in the class, especially when it comes to difficult topics. So the 3 things that have already been mentioned by the 2 that I've spoken so far. The first one I had was, establishing an inclusive environment early on. The second was starting where the student is, and I'll expound on those in a little bit. And then educative use of self. And so so when you start with the first one, I think that's pretty clear in being able to set those ground rules at the very beginning. And with social work, a lot of the topics that we touch on is throughout the semester on every class, there is a room to be able to talk about these difficult conversations. And so part of what I find helpful is being able to contextualize that from the very beginning, that we will be talking about difficult things, and that critical thinking is very important, especially in this learning space. So the various and different views are very important for students to bring to the table. And so I'm looking for that, and I encourage that, and I will create that controversy if it's not there. And so that it forces them to kind of think through those spaces and be okay in that environment where there's difficult conversations. And then the second point, so one of the most important social work tenets that we use is starting where the client is. But in this case, I like to look at it as starting where the student is. So in this space, it means that especially when you get, so like Jacob talked about, the students that are not ready, right? That they may not have maybe the views that we're hoping that they have, but that it's important to acknowledge that and let students know that it's okay for them to be in a certain place, because they did not get there out of nowhere. The experiences that they have informed them to make, to see the world the way that they see it. And so, so with this particular area, so what I try to do here is, when I've had like a student maybe who voices an opinion that may be coming out offensive, and I'll give a very specific example where a student was feeling like, this issue of racism is a non-issue, right? It's just distracting from the main issues, and they're not being able, they're not able to see that as a problem. And so then we have students that are getting offended by that. And so part of what I try to do in that space is being able to help the students around, right, in the classroom, but the student as well that is expressing that, to help them see that it's okay where they are. So kind of go through some of the experiences that they've had through their lives. So if they're like the majority, they've never had to see race as an issue, that makes sense that they're in that position. So helping students to see that it's okay for people to be where they're at, but then how do we then move them forward? Especially for our field, it's pretty easy, because part of what we're trying to teach students is working with clients and being able to understand somebody without maybe not agreeing with them, but being able to understand as the Savior understands us. And so that's one area that has been very helpful for me, is being able to validate, because that experience is legit, the way they see it. But then once we can acknowledge and validate that experience, then we create the room for them to move forward and grow as the new information is presented to them. Which kind of brings me to the third point, which in therapy we'll use therapeutic use of self, but here I like to see it as educative use of self. So this is where this idea of vulnerability comes in, that the other two have talked about. And so the way that I look at this vulnerability piece is, first of all, as educators in this position, we have to model that behavior for the students. But that also means that we need to take a step back, especially on the various topics, and we know the topics we're touching on in particular class, to examine our own positionality. How did we get where we are? What are some of the biases that we are bringing to the table? Because then when we're able to reflect on that and are aware, it makes us more capable to align and even understand the students that may not necessarily be ready. And so with a particular student, and I'll use this, so you have to be comfortable with being able to share, because if students come into the classroom, the way that I've seen that from my own experience, if they feel like we're just perfect, we have all these great opinions on everything, then it kind of gives them, it may push them away from being able to voice when they feel differently. But by me recognizing where I've been and how I got to where I am, it helps me be able to align with a student so they can see my own growth. So, and being a Black woman, so for me, like, I use this as an advantage, right? Like, here, I'm a controversy work, some of the topics that are coming up. So I can use my own example. So I remember having a student that, especially coming on the topic of race, and that talked about being some of their biases in terms of being afraid of like Black people, for example. And so then I bring my own experience in there, and actually, I use a lot of humor in this space as well. So, we don't take ourselves too seriously as they're learning, but being able to use my own example in my own growth. So then if I align, for example, when I myself was afraid of a Black person, then I can use that as a tool in helping them how I was able to move from one place to another. And so, so that I found is a very, very important tool, especially modeling behavior, and ties a lot more with the Savior's example and why he had to come to earth to model behavior for us as well. So I find that has been a very important tool in being able to help students, especially the ones that struggle, but also the others that may not be happy with different opinions, and how to be able to be okay in that space as we give each other room to grow. So I can explain and expound on some of those examples down the road, but I think I'll end there.
Thank you, Sharina. You actually did have quite a bit to add, so I appreciate you sharing that. So I'll just finish up with a couple thoughts, and I really appreciate what was already shared. I'm taking notes, very useful, very helpful, I appreciate it. So my points kind of revolve around two concepts, setting the tone and being the mentor. So when we are talking about having difficult conversations in the classroom, I think that is often around race, but now it's often around other topics too, that didn't used to be as controversial as they are now. So that might even be political perspectives, or so it's a bit of a volatile time to be having courageous conversations in the classroom. So setting the tone, by this I mean I start my classes, whatever the topic is, teaching them how to learn. So because they can gain information in so many different ways now, I help them understand how to learn the way that a scientist learns. So like Jake said, hey, this is the classroom in which we're talking from a sociology perspective. Similarly, I'm teaching from a social science perspective, and that's how we learn together. And I help them understand that there's a difference between opinion and scientific data, and what that looks like and what the process is for understanding that. So, and then I help them learn, give them in-class opportunities to practice using a scientific approach, which is curiosity, skepticism, and humility. So they can ask questions like, what is this person's agenda? What are the biases here? What justifications do they have for making this statement? And that's how I start all of my classes. It's not tough for them because it's not very controversial, but it is framing. This is how we're going to talk about our topics. It's framing it for them within that framework. And then the next thing I do with all my classes, I introduce to them to the idea of the beloved community, because that's the community I want to create in our classroom. And so the beloved community is the Martin Luther King Jr.'s community. He didn't actually coin the term, but he made it most popular. And he says in that beloved community, to create it, it'll require an inner change in the quality of our soul, as well as an outer change in the quantity of our compassionate actions. So I share that statement with them. We learn about how the beloved community came about. And then I move into a talk by Elder Uchtdorf that's very similar to Martin Luther King Jr.'s discussion, in which he says, come help us build and strengthen a culture of healing, kindness, and mercy toward all of God's children, for we are becoming new creatures. So we talk about becoming new in our class together, and that will maybe look different than how we've learned before. And then for the second point, being the mentor, several of my colleagues have already touched on this, and Sharina highlighted the importance of our own vulnerability and self-reflection. So part of being the mentor, I study a lot of underrepresented communities, a lot of diverse communities, and some of my research lends itself to good case examples, and it's often harder to argue with a position that is spoken by a real person that I've sat with. So that can be very useful. So if you don't have those kind of examples, you get them. So that means you need to stretch yourself a bit, okay? So challenge yourself to create a more diverse pool from which you speak. And then also, we have to practice cultural humility. That means we have to be, and we have to teach it, practice it and teach it. So we have to be willing to explore new things, to let go of ego and teach our students to do that. And as Sharina mentioned, being self-reflective and be supportive in our interactions. And then to the last point, practice and preach. So developing empathy, remembering our students all have a history, all have a background. They're coming from a place in which they were informed. Some of the things they say are kind of rude and kind of obnoxious, but usually that is not the intention. They have been taught it from somewhere. And part of our job is help them to learn a new way of seeing the world. So when we interact with them, we want to try to see through their eyes. We want to remember that this is an opportunity to reflect who we truly think they are. Every time we engage with a student is a chance to make their lives a little bit better, whether it's an email or a conversation, and they will feel that and respect that, and that will naturally engender more respectful classroom conversations. Also, that's how we're part of creating the beloved community. So, and then we also, we set ground rules, particularly in diversity classes. We set ground rules for brave spaces and courageous conversations. So working with Dawn Marie, we had our students who are serving on the diversity committee come up with some ground rules. So my last point here, I just want to quickly share what those look like so you get a sense of it. So they're the ground rules that they came up with. And by the way, the ground rules are collective. As the beloved community, we make them together. I don't dictate what those are. We come up with them and we agree on them together so that they have buy-in. And so those ground rules, and these are unique to this group, but they're very similar to what I hear in most settings when we do this kind of exercise. So make the most generous assumptions about others' intentions. Give people the benefit of the doubt and consider their context. So remember, these are our BYU students who came up with this. Respect others' personal boundaries and timelines for sharing. Acknowledge the right to pass. So sometimes you're not in a position where you want to share. Take responsibility and accountability for the energy you bring into the group. So they clarified that by saying taking responsibility for your own thoughts, words, and impact. Specify that your insights are your own. So this refers to, sometimes people will say things like, well, you know, a Latter-day Saints believe, instead of say, and so I'll say, okay, say it like this. As a Latter-day Saint, I feel this way. So that you're still owning your positionality on that identification. Or as a woman, I feel this way, instead of saying women feel this way or men feel this way. And then the last one they have is embrace discomfort, including a range of emotion, yours or others, with authenticity and sensitivity. So don't dismiss your feelings or others' feelings. So, and I'm also, this is a point where I'm a little bit vulnerable and say, I'm probably going to say things wrong sometimes. I'm going to call DJ David. And then I hope that if we care about each other enough and we want to create the beloved community, DJ will be able to say, well, you know, I really prefer to be called DJ. So could you use that instead? And I'll say, okay, that's great. Thanks for letting me know. And because I don't have an ego I'm trying to protect around it, right? And DJ, I think you were the one that said it's a little different for women. It's difficult sometimes because authority at BYU isn't easily granted to women. Anywhere it isn't, but particularly a number of our BYU students do assume we're sister whoever. So I appreciated Jake's comment about his mother. Like, oh, I'm going to remember that one. So, and it does help when male colleagues take responsibility for keeping their label, even though they wouldn't need to hold their authority. It does help women to be able to be called doctor or professor. So anyway, those are my main points. And it's, you know, having different opinions is not only okay, it's important to learning. It's part of the Socratic process of gaining critical thought, that we can guide our students in the ways that we do that. So I happened to be reading in Elma this morning, and it was talking about contention and strife. And I thought, well, when it says avoid contention, it's saying, in other words, avoid strife. And strife means seeking for a superior position. So we want to help our students to be open as they discuss different positions. All right, I think it's a good time now for us to turn the time over to the rest of you for questions. Now, maybe the best way to do this is, I don't notice on my reaction buttons that I have a hand. I do have like clapping, so maybe we just raise our hand or speak out. And then I will put this on speaker view, so hopefully I can see you. But also, please feel free to say, you know, speak out, because there's 46 of us here, so it's hard for me to know who's trying to ask a question. And you're welcome to ask specific panel members or to ask as a group.
Well, this is Michael South in psychology. I'm trying to let other people go because I feel like I have enough questions to take up the whole rest of the time. I won't. But I know, Jacob, at least you teach some GE classes. I struggle. I love all the things you guys said. They're all great. And I've tried to do a bunch of the specific ideas that you guys have talked about. But my classes with 120, 140 people, I even have tried to tell them, not as explicitly as you, Jacob, don't take this class if you're not on board. I'm going to make that even more explicit, but I've tried to tell them. But I just get people that are really hard to bring around. And so I thought, do I teach just the ones who want to learn? but what about the ones who are out there? Sometimes they're disruptive, but you know, I brought in Lita and her DCI panel this semester, and they did a fantastic job. And so many of my students were so moved by the experiences shared. They really enjoyed this. But at the same time, I had people on the Zoom chat saying like, this is a waste of my tuition money. Why am I taking this class? During the panel, right? And I just don't know what to do with these. I don't know how to do it when I have so many people, how to have these conversations without just racism, overt, hostile racism, or sexuality. How do I do with these big classes? That's my question.
A great question. I mean, I've dealt with that in class. I haven't taught a large class on Zoom yet. I've taught a lot of large classes not on Zoom. But I know there has been controversies this semester, multiple ones, you're not alone, where the Zoom chat function and other aspects of Zoom bring out, like you say, we've spent a whole $1 trillion on implicit bias, but explicit bias is also a major problem. So I'd love to hear from others about how they've addressed that. And I can see how Carrie's ground rules play right into this, but specifically what you bring up. Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, I don't deal with the challenge of actually having that many students, so I can understand how that can be really a real issue. The largest my classes usually get are into the low 60s. One thing I do have a little bit of a different approach from Jake in that I let my students know that I want them to stay in my class. I don't want them to drop. If they feel they need to drop for whatever reason, the workload's too high, whatever, you know, that stuff. But I hope and I plead with them not to drop just because they're uncomfortable. And as long as they're willing to be respectful and know that I'm going to be respectful to them too, like that question. What I would do with that question, I would pose it to the class. I would create time in the class and I'd say, this is a perspective that is often given. An example was recently, a few weeks ago when I addressed the issue of immigration. We eventually got into illegal immigration. And I shared a lot of data, a lot of the facts, basically point out the fact that there's no such thing as illegal immigration in the INA Act, and talk about the politicized nature of this, touch on topics about how we need to be careful of using that word, that illegal is not a noun, et cetera, right? But then I open up by, maybe to Sharina's point, baiting them a little bit by saying, but there is a perspective, right? And I'll share a common known wrong perspective, right? According to at least research in social science and history, right? But I'll say that people feel this way, right? And they feel very strongly about this perspective. Let's talk about it, right? And so some ways I'll try to go that conversations, I'll throw out these things. I'll throw out ideas like, again, on immigration, you know, there's the claim that illegal immigrants don't pay taxes. The claim that illegal immigrants or immigrants in general steal jobs. So I'll toss these things out there, right, to try to get the conversation going and try to let them know that this is a space where we can discuss that. I want to, if someone felt that it was a waste of their time, then what I'd like to do with that is I'd like to open up to the rest of the class so that it's not just me speaking, right, and being the one that they're kind of confronting with, but that they can hear their peers' perspectives and their peers can share their backgrounds. And often my students will do that. They'll start by saying, I was raised in the South, right, and this is what I experienced growing up, or I was raised in, you know, Kaysville, Utah, right, and so on. And so trying to get as much of the class to show their perspective too. I've experienced, again, in a smaller class, about half the size of yours, even on Zoom, that it helps at least to bring that tone down. Now, I have to accept that some students are just never going to be comfortable sharing, and they probably hold those thoughts and they just don't share them. But I don't know too much what I can do to crack that. But I do want the students in my class. I would rather have them take my class. This is probably egotistical. I don't mean it that way, but than any other. Just because I know what we're going to address in it. And I presume that it will be the last history class that they take. And so I want to address all those issues and those perspectives. Again, so long as I state that, you know, that we remain respectful, right? And how we share that and how we address each other.
One point of clarification, because I'm going to get misquoted on this lunch and people are going to talk about it for years. I don't invite people to drop the class if they're not on board with the content. It's if they're not on board with the ground rules of respect and agency in the gospel. Just Just put that in the record. That was recorded.
Hey, good clarification. That's all right.
All right.
Awesome. And just to add on to DJ's comments as well, especially I haven't had large classes. I think the biggest classes that we have in the program is about 40, and they are not dropping or anything like that, right? So part of what I think, again, the idea of being able to understand where your students are at is important. I think especially if you see a pattern of like maybe certain topics in the classes that you teach where you have very strong opinions on the other end for students that are difficult, I think being able to contextualize that at the very beginning so that every, at least a spectrum of different opinions that are there are covered. So if you are throwing out like, some may feel this way, some may feel that way, so that the students that may not align with maybe where the majority opinion is, do not feel left out. So the way that I see it is that it's not my job to try and convince all my students to have, specific opinions, but my role is to be able to help them have the tools that can help them move forward when they're ready to move forward. So we may be starting with them at a cognitive capacity, but the hope is over time they can move that change to the heart, similar to how we try to convey the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so I think with those particular students that are difficult, if you could find ways to be able, again, so that they feel understood, that a lot of their opinions, their context and their upbringing informs how they see the world now. So if we make it that it's okay that they have the different opinions, there's nothing wrong with where they're at, but are they willing to move? So then part of that is, even in the classroom, I'll have like discussions. Like I said, I'll bring controversial questions, different opinions for people to kind of talk about. But I've also had topics I remember particular where it was like a topic of abortion, that there was a lot of opinions on both ends, right? And so part of what I did was like have people raise hands that had really strong opinions on the one end and on the other end. And then in the discussions, and was to have the person, for example, who is like pro-abortion, spend time reading and finding argument for the opposite. So they're kind of forcing them to look at their opposing, the view that they're really against. So if somebody is, the whole racism issue is having them defend the side that sees racism as an issue. So they're looking at those points. So being able to create those opportunities for the students, even in their assignments or even in the discussions that we're having through the classroom, to explore the different sides of the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. Do you have any other questions?
I have a question. This is Elisa from History. So I have two questions. Feel free to answer one and or both. So I'd be curious on less generalized examples of how you specifically have asked students to examine their own bias, and how you talk about bias in ways that show that everything is biased. It's not, so I have found that students hear the word bias and immediately they have a negative connotation without realizing that everything has bias. Maybe Jake, as you were talking about that triangle, but so I'm curious what specific things you have done to put students in a position to examine that bias that they bring in a way that hopefully minimizes them being defensive about that bias. And my second question is kind of similar. So, and maybe I would need to refresh on the FHSS inclusion statement. But when we talk about having a respectful environment, how are you being very specific in what that looks like and sounds like, either virtually or in person? Because again, I tend to think most students aren't trying to be disrespectful, but they don't know what respectful looks like or sounds like. They don't have that modeling in place for them. So any of you have kind of addressed both of these things in some capacity. So one and or both from any of you, I'd like to hear some kind of specifics on how you define those and then put students in a position to examine their bias.
So I'll go ahead and quickly and respond to that, but also check your chat because we're getting a lot of great responses in our chat as well. So we got a lot of wisdom in the room. But so the second point is, I would say go to the FHSS and have even put that in your syllabus, have students use that as a frame. It's pretty good at explaining what respectful should look like. And then to your first point, I think the resistance to bias is shame. So right up front, I start by talking about how we learn to have the perspectives we do. So I let them have a private time of self-reflection. So I give them a worksheet actually that has just a list of different demographic features of people. So maybe woman or transgender person, and it's a list, and they go through and they're supposed to do their very quick response to it. They'll never share it. And then I say, okay, now where did you learn that perspective? So I use the word perspective at first before I jump into bias, because you're right, these words get awfulized and then you have to find a new way to talk about them because the door shuts before you even address it. So, and then I work really hard to reduce the shame by saying we all have them. We all have these views that we got taught. We're not bad people who intentionally try to have stereotyped views. So first, before you even talk about bias, I talk about stereotypes and help them understand that they are not responsible for what was taught to them, but now as adults responsible for learning a new way to think about them. But that it's something we all have. It's part of being part of society. So working on minimizing the shame up front about our biases, as opposed to getting angry about them when they show up, even being compassionate towards ourselves. Like, oh, there that is. I think I learned that from my grandpa, or I learned that from media. And then, so we demonstrate a kind of a compassionate tone towards ourselves so that we're comfortable and brave about sharing biases because we don't feel overly responsible for obtaining them, but responsible for re-informing them.
One of our most unexpectedly successful days in our class, is it Alyssa? Is that right? I'm seeing your name right?
It's Elisa.
Elisa, okay. I want to make sure. Elisa is about the Asian American success frame that is the product of immigration law and racial stereotypes and bias. So kind of a sociology, history, law, and social psychology. And we talk about what does it mean to be successful? Well, that's a highly racialized idea. What is success? Asian Americans tend to compare themselves to each other and the most affluent and highly achieving members of their group. And that is a product of external, internal things. Many Mexican Americans in the study compare themselves to the generation before. So they actually feel the most successful of all the racial groups, even if on paper they're somewhere in the middle. Black Americans tend to have the most in common with Asian Americans, that they both say that college is absolutely essential because they know they have to hit a certain requirement, a certain score in order to escape and pass the threshold of bias and discrimination. And most people don't think that Asian Americans and Black Americans have the most in common. It's just that one group has a lot more resources than the other because of immigration law, right? And then white Americans tend to have the most individualistic success frame, no surprise. And they tend to emphasize that they didn't rely on any government support and a lot of things that are racialized. So what's great about that, those chapters from the award-winning book, Asian American Achievement Paradox, is it leads to a great discussion about what is your success frame? How is that gendered? How is that based on you growing up in a suburban versus an urban environment? Being a first-gen student or not? Being LDS or not, right? What major did you pick? How did that, based on your gender and things like that? And that is a great discussion to understand bias beyond an individual level psychosocial issue and one that has deep history and roots and things like immigration law, slavery, lots of other things. And it really explodes a lot of stereotypes, right? That Mexicans are the most successful immigrants when you look at where they go from one generation to the next, added value perspective, right? So that's one example. Another one we just do for immigration, and DJ brought this up earlier, is just I always have them read David Brooks. I have them read the Cato Institute Libertarian Perspective. Another perspective, I do moderate, liberal, libertarian, and conservative, all four. And then all four of them talking about how we can do immigration reform, and then having the students look for overlap in the perspectives. And because a lot of those things like libertarians actually do really good with the data. They show really persuasively that immigrants commit a lot less crime than native-born Americans. The students kind of see like, oh yeah, when you pursue the truth, like these different perspectives can overlap. So that's 2 examples. But that Asian American unit in our class is just one of the best, and it's so unexpected for the students how much insight they got, no matter what their racial background is.
Yeah, if I could add a couple things real quick. I totally understand that I try to avoid the use of the term bias in my classes just because it shuts students off so quickly. And when they use it, I can see how they're using it to shut down discussion, right? So I try to teach them a synonym for bias, just perspective, right? And background, and that everyone has their perspective and their frame, right? And so in class discussions, the way I'll do this is if I hear, I'll try my best not to address an overly biased opinion from a student right away. I'll keep asking for more and more input, and I'll wait. I'll sit and wait 30 seconds or a minute if I have to. I got no problem with it, you know, because I don't test them based on my lectures. So this is why I can use my whole class if I need to, the whole 50 minutes to talk about one issue, right? Because they're not going to be tested upon what's in class. They're tested what they're reading and stuff like that. The other thing I'll contribute to this is that I've integrated an assignment in my class that teaches them to write from a neutral, to try to not write from a biased perspective. And that's I have them author a Wikipedia assignment or article and page. And there's a whole process of how this is done. And they learn about the rigor that they have to go through in order to author a Wikipedia page. And I customize it for our class, and they do an annotated bibliography. And so it's like a research project, and they do it in pairs, so it's not overwhelming. But I love it because the last part of my last 2 weeks of class, it's just students presenting on their Wikipedia pages, and they're doing that right now. And I kid you not, almost every single one of them, their biggest takeaway that they love is learning how to write in a neutral, unbiased perspective, because we train them to write from argument. And so their brains are functioning like that, right, through K through 12. And so it's so easy for them to cherry pick materials. And the assignment is broken up, you know, into several pieces. So they're getting feedback from me and peers as they're drafting, as they're working on this. And so they're getting critiqued for their bias, and they're seeing their bias, right? They're getting shown to it. And I'm not necessarily the one always just to point it out to them. So my suggestion is to find assignments that can do that as well. I try not to be the one that's saying that's biased, that's wrong, rather engaging them in a discussion to where someone else's perspective and opinion maybe contradicts or challenges theirs a little more, so they have to self-reflect on that, right? And then through the assignments themselves, they are being graded on their ability to write in a neutral point of view.
I have a question. It's not about the bias, which I've really appreciated that discussion, but I teach a massive class this semester and will next semester on Zoom, like hundreds of people. And I've had this experience of the chat just being completely bombed by people. I've had trolls in the first week of class. We had trolls. It was very frustrating. They were like posting their Instagram like messages and like follow me on Insta kind of stuff. And that was just getting really inappropriate. So I had to be very explicit about what is allowed on the chat. But I had one experience that I thought was interesting. I'm curious if people have different perspectives on it. But you know, I've taught these massive classes before, and there is this general problem of male students taking up way more time than female students in their comments. And it's like this kind of constant thing I have to be aware of and try to address somehow without shaming people. This time, however, because it was Zoom and the students aren't experiencing peer-to-peer, like in your face pressure, I had this experience where a female student is speaking and a male student interrupted her in the Zoom. And he said, like, I'm sorry, I have to interrupt. And as he did that, probably about 25 students, and again, this is like 100 students, but like 25. So I think in that Zoom class, I had 500 people logged in, and 25 people immediately bombed the text and were like, shut up. And they just told the guy to shut up and stop talking, let her speak. Well, it turned out that she was sharing a stereotype she had about Latino men. And he was like, I'm a Latino man, and I feel like I have to say something. So yes, he was interrupting her, but you know, I think his perspective was pretty valid in that he should be able to share something about himself. And I took that opportunity to just kind of share that with everybody, of saying like, hey, I'm really glad that everybody had a lot of thoughts and feelings about the necessity to let each other speak. However, I think people should be able to share things about themselves when, you know, that aspect of themselves is being talked about in the class. And I then instituted a rule in class, which I'm sure almost nobody follows, but it did cut down the trolling, which was, I said, please do not comment on the chat immediately, like count to 5 and then comment. And the chat has really improved since then, because it's not just mass, like I have hundreds of people logged in, and like the chat, if you just follow it, it's like, it's just constantly going, and people are being vicious to each other every now and then. And it's really bad. So I'm curious what people think to do that, what I could have done better, or like what we could learn from that, because that was a wild experience for me.
Jordan, that is, I mean, just having 500 in a class, to me, there seems like some structure we'll have to think about as a college for these large classes on Zoom, and the kind of the support you would need. But I'm curious what Sharina has to say about this.
First thing, I was like, oh my goodness, I am glad I don't have 500 people on Zoom. But so yeah, Jordan, for sure, that sounds like challenging, but I definitely like the way you handled it. I think that was important in taking that opportunity to be able to highlight some of the importance of maybe some of the way society is framed, right? I mean, you talked about the whole gender differences with men taking more time and opportunity to speak in the classroom. So I think being able to capture those moments when things are happening in the classroom, and I know it catches us off guard, is never preparing with what happens in the classroom sometimes. And so trying to think on your feet and being able to articulate, like, this is a live example right now of like how this has played out. So I think, again, coming back to that recognition, which sounds like you did that with the male and why he felt the need to interact. So being able to acknowledge and validate that, but then also touch on the person that was sharing their opinion. And so I think that is important. And I think that's when we try to create those opportunities, like learning in the moment, demonstrate that, again, modeling that behavior, but also asking the students for maybe better ways and how that can be handled. So then we kind of put back some of that responsibility on the students to be able to come up with better ways to handle those kind of situations. That's, I think, how I would go about dealing with that. And I'm trying to think too with what your other question was with that one. So, and the one thing that I found helpful, because I don't have a class as big, so I don't know if that would be helpful, but having certain students to that help to monitor some of the activity that's going on, so kind of setting those ground rules up front about what's appropriate to put up there. But I also have every class time have a student that monitors that chat room for things that are important and things that come up. Yeah. And I think the advantage of that particular situation is with Zoom, at least a lot of what I do is kind of throw students in small groups, so maybe 3-4 people. So even in that situation that you had, that would be a good opportunity to just have a random, out of nowhere, let's get a breakout room for maybe 2-3 people to kind of explore some of the issues and what would be the best ways to navigate some of the problems that arise with issues of diversity and how some of those, again, the biases that may come up. But I think validating those experiences is important for the one that was, maybe the offended, but also the one who may be in this position, and then how can they explore further, like where they're at and how to move forward from there.
Yeah.
That's great.
I
I have to pause this just for a second, Jordan. Sorry. I'm being mindful of time and my responsibility to pay attention to that. But go ahead and use the chat if you have more you wanted to mention about that. I like what you're saying, Sharina, break out into smaller groups and maybe make sure to utilize a TA in that situation. So there's sort of somebody there to help moderate those groups. Dean Walker, I think that our time is up. Am I right on that?
I'm going to turn that over to Dean Otterstrom.
Okay.
Well, this is a great conversation. So we can continue. I know we have people that are already having to sign off because of other obligations, but I wanted to thank everyone, the panel and everyone for participating. And Bruce will be getting this online, and for those people who want some of this on the chat too, he's going to make a PDF of that. So, but thank you for everyone, and thanks, Carrie, for helping moderate the discussion as we've gone through. It's been fantastic.
Is the Zoom staying open for discussion then?
Yeah, I'll keep it open. Yeah, it's fine.
Okay. Do we have any panel members that have to leave, or are you all okay to stay a little longer?
I can stay for 10 more minutes.
Okay.
If you don't mind, I would like to kind of follow up with what she said about the moderating chat. I think is such a great idea. I am wondering if other people have had experience with TAs. So I've had a problem with some TAs kicking other students out of the chat, because I'll tell the TAs like, hey, please moderate the chat. And they'll just straight up kick people out. I find out after the fact. And then they've also called other students racist. And I've repeatedly had TA meetings of saying like, look, we need to just kind of calm down and try to, but we're all adults here, and we all know how to deal with really stressful situations because we have a lot of history with that. But our TAs do not necessarily. And so I'm kind of want to know how to deal with them.
One really quick thing. I'm lucky because my TAs went through my class, so they're amazing. In some ways, they're better than me. They are from very diverse backgrounds. I make sure I always have at least one white TA, right? Because sometimes the white students will only talk to a white TA. One simple thing, you can pay them to audit my class as a guest, and when they attend, they can just be paid. I mean, I'm sure you have enough for them to spend 2 hours a week. That's one simple thing. I know you guys have more thoughtful replies, but I'm serious. I wouldn't count that out.
I also think we have a great resource in Lida's DCI team. Being able to do, kind of specialized training for some of our TAs could be helpful, especially for those big classes where additional help is needed.
Yeah, I've as soon as after last spring, I immediately added a statement to my syllabus about Zoom etiquette, and I spend the first day. I don't go through all points of my syllabus, but that's one thing I bring up and emphasize what will not be tolerated on Zoom conversations and what Zoom chat is for. And I tell them Zoom chat is for particularly raising questions, asking questions, but also making very short, brief comments that apply directly to what we're talking about at the point, right? The content of the lecture or the content of the discussion. These are not to be, just an opinion or something that you bring off from somewhere else. And then I do use my TA or TAs to help police that, for lack of a better term. And then if a student's being a problem, then I'll email them directly and I'll raise it with the student. I don't ask the TA to do that, and then that's just too much power for TA, right? Even though I pick TAs and use TAs that I really do trust and I'm very familiar with them. I mean, just thinking of your particular situation, Jordan, that many students, oh my gosh, I would seriously consider, someone on here suggested making it so that they can only make comments directly to you and maybe not to others. And then maybe you could integrate using the TAs to select comments that are representative of like a theme that several students are basically making comments that are raising this question or that pertain to this issue, and then have the TA. And I pray that you have TAs for a
Oh yeah, no, I've got time.
Oh, okay,
But
good.
I didn't even know that that was an option for chat. So that's actually really helpful to know. I didn't know it was an option. Thanks.
Awesome. And I think just to add to that as well, you know, further than just moderating the TAs, and I think training is important too with the TAs and what we're expecting for them on what's appropriate and what is not, as well as, and I think DJ's idea of, for the notorious, you know, the students that are repetitively kind of engaging some of these behaviors, I think it's important to have that, whether it's the email or the in-person meeting. I'm not sure about feasibility for 500 students, because you know, like with mine, 40 is like the largest that I have to do, that I work with. But oh, I just kind of, there's one important thought that I hadn't just like left my mind. But but anyway, so I think that's one way that you can definitely navigate that, is having somebody, you know, train the students. And oh, here we go, consequences. That was the other thing, accountability. So part of, like, especially in our field, a lot of the grades that we give students go beyond just, you know, the cognitive pieces, right? Like the passing their exams or their tests and stuff. So it could be that adding, especially if it's a repetitive pattern that you see this semester and next semester, is finding ways that in the grading, there's somewhere where that respect and the professionalism aspect is accounted for. Because sometimes, unfortunately, grades tend to motivate, well, they are important in academia when they need good grades. So that's another opportunity that you may have to build in some kind of points into the final grade, where you could determine some of those behaviors that would dock them if they continue engaging in that kind of behavior. So I've found that could be helpful, especially when you're dealing with undergraduate courses.
So I like that idea of having it incorporated as part of their grade. And I've labeled that before as professionalism. So that, you know, once they understand kind of the other things I talked about how to follow ground rules and take responsibility for their comments, if you kind of frame that within, you are now in your college education, university education, learning how to be a professional in the workplace. And you're going to need to learn these skills to effectively do that. Then professionalism can be it can be part of the participation points or something like that, so that there is that accountability there. Laura, did you have something you wanted to say?
I'm just thinking about Jordan, that's kind of hard with 500. I guess I was just thinking, want to make sure, are you guys getting feedback? I feel like I'm getting feedback when I'm talking. We just want to, I don't like the word punishment, and maybe it's because I'm a socialization scholar, but it's not generally effective. I think that we would want to be careful that the grade wasn't tied to your perspective, but the way in which you communicate that perspective. Because being over rank and status, looking at hundreds of teaching evaluations a year, I think it's our conservative students who feel actually more commonly feel silenced in the class now than, at least that's what I see coming up. And while I think that there's certainly certain things that they shouldn't say, and definitely ways they shouldn't say them, I think a lot of times that's an opportunity for us to teach, and we wouldn't want to shut that down with punishment. But I can think of, you know, when Michael was talking, that if you've got someone who you've talked to and they're repeatedly saying things that are rude, and then that makes more sense to me. But I guess I've just heard a little bit of stuff about punishment being tossed around, and we've had a few of those issues come up this semester, and I think the way we talked about dealing with them as a DCI committee was really just approaching it as an opportunity to teach. And as long as that is, you know, effective and they're willing to change, I think maybe what Michael and Jacob are talking about is when it's not effective and they're just continuing to be belligerent. But even then, I like the word accountability more than punishment. Maybe it's semantics, but to me that makes a difference.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification. I like that a lot. Sorry, Jake.
No, I know the topic's about having difficult discussions, but really, when you're doing a really intense class about a controversial topic, there needs to be digital dialogues, quiet writings, essays, reflections, interviews. You need to have at least 10 modes of people, right, sounding off. Because when they start to do it in the more structured environments, then they get more of a chance.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If you're going one mode and you're just cramming them all down to this one tunnel, right? It's going to come out in these ways. That's a luxury that I built into my class. That's not a luxury I can do in all my classes, right? But my intro class, the same thing. I have tons of digital dialogues. And sometimes these things are a symptom of the way we design and structure things. And if we can do that, that's the one way I've learned to make it better, because I will definitely model the students. I'll say, hey, I had this principal conservative on immigration. Their op-ed was so good, I made it one of the assigned readings for you guys, right? And you guys already know that's not my perspective, right? So really modeling that is so important, that there's multiple modes. And I know this whole Zoom thing is new to all of us, and boy, I'm going to make a lot of mistakes next semester, right? But somehow, if they have multiple outlets, right, and then you have that dialogue with them, right, and some of it's through writing and stuff, I think it can really make a big, big difference with people. I've seen a lot of people have a lot of growth, just like what Laura, talked about.
Yeah. If you don't mind, I'd like to read what Greg posted, because it seems like it might be something worth a conversation. Greg says, racism is bad, in quotation marks, is something that everyone seems to agree upon, but I have found that there are vastly different definitions as what counts as racism, and that seems to lead to serious and significant trouble these days. For example, white supremacists, or people who hold white supremacist views, will often say they oppose racism. Oops, that just moved. Sorry, hold on a minute here. Oppose racism. Any thoughts on productive ways to address this? So I'm going to throw this back to the panel.
Yeah, I can talk how I do it in my class. I start out with definitions, and I bring in definitions that are from historians, from sociologists, anthropologists, and I try to engage my class in the conversation. Okay, let's bring these together. Let's distill this. Let's make a definition for our class and for this discussion. For me, where I can say this is going to be hard, right? And if you're trying to solve this in one day, right, in a class. My class has the luxury to where, because race, inequality of all types, period, but race is a primary theme in my class that we analyze through various different perspectives. It goes down to why I make them read the Black authors, Indigenous authors, women, right? It's to break down, right, that view of, whether it's intellectual superiority or not, right? And so essentially my answer here, my whole class, right, is teaching them how to complicate their definitions and understand what racism is by showing them historical example after example after example after creating, and after by also showing them examples to see how race isn't just a black-white thing, right? Through immigration policy, we show how racism against Irish, affected immigration policy then, against Jews, Italians, etc. So I involve a lot of women's history, right? I try to show examples of how, people from various, groups and backgrounds can, become aggrieved, as a result of prejudicial and discriminatory views. But again, my class has that luxury. But again, so my contribution will be is, you have to plan, how you can address this in your class over time, and not think it can be solved by, and I'm not presuming anybody's saying this, but I think you can just handle it one time. And you're right that they're going to be the students that aren't going to be convinced by the scholarly definitions, right? And that's why it needs to be worked into assignments, it needs to be worked into digital dialogues and class discussions, so that they can also learn from their peers, right? We can present the scholarly evidence, but as we know in this time, people are so willing to just cast that off, right, as whatever biased or view that there may be. So there just has to be several opportunities for them to engage in discussion and conversation over this.
I like that, DJ. I think I'm just going to add to that, I try to teach them what the field says about that. So similar to what you're saying, DJ. So even if they say, hey, that I don't like that definition, or that's not how I learned that definition, I'm teaching them the profession of their field. So I think each one of us, it'd be worthwhile, even if you don't teach on this topic, to know what that is. How does your field define white supremacy? How does your field define racism? What are the conversations being had in your field? It'll take a little bit of work on your part as a professor, but I think it's worthwhile so that you can communicate from that perspective. Whether or not they reject it, it's just like any other topic that I'm teaching from my field. And that's the things they need to learn if they're in that course.
You know, there's two things that I do, and one's hopeful and one's not so hopeful. Let me start with the less hopeful thing for you, Greg. I think one of the less hopeful things is, as long as there are classes that are so homogeneous in terms of race, this is going to be a very difficult barrier to surmount. And we can't tell fairy tales about having a magic bullet, because I found that's one of the biggest differences. When I have a class that is 100 people and it's 40% students of color, that is a totally different class than a class that's 90% white. Because at the end of the day, with so many students of color being able to share based on the training and then their own experience, people just can't deny their humanity by the end of 28 sessions, right? It's going to be maybe 1 out of 100 that are going to still push against that, but 99% of the people are going to be moved by that. Now, when you have an environment where people feel like they're the token, they're the only person that's Native American, right? I've had a class with people from 7 tribes, Native American, very different, right? That's going to be a whole different difficulty. And we're going to have to, I think, be a lot more inspired about what we do, how we build on our own strengths. I've seen Sharina's strengths, Carrie's strengths, DJ's strengths that are amazing. I think I was reading a lesson manual this summer about Alma, I forgot which chapter, but it's in there, it's true, how the testimony of the saints can be one of the most powerful things there to testify of truth. And what I've found is, because I was raised by Kathy Stokes and many other famous Black pioneers, is Black Latter-day Saints and Latter-day Saints of color are perhaps the #1 thing you have at as a teacher, to have their testimony of truth, where the students have that overlap with them being LDS like the other person, but then that person facing interpersonal, institutional racism, and then how it relates to their testimony. That is not something that's a one-size-fits-all approach. I think it's very much on a spectrum. I mean, I could be teaching socialization as a concept early on in the class. I can talk about one of my most brilliant writers. She's at Chicago Law School. You know, she knew cryptography and all these languages. She was a May return missionary, and she's also Black, right? And here's her picture, and she broke all these barriers, right? And it had a lot more meaning to the students when I could bring in, because maybe she wasn't in my class anymore, but maybe I could bring her in to the lecture in that way. And again, anything I'm saying has to be done with a lot of inspiration, care. But I think the structural issue is, if people just feel like they can just ride roughshod over people because there are not a lot of people of color there, and I've seen the difference. I've seen white men behave differently when the structure is different. Then that is going to require of the instructor a lot more inspiration and guidance in how you're going to adapt to that, right? And that's a big reason why we want BYU to be more diverse in the future, right? Because it will be a better classroom learning environment. I've been to the mountaintop. I've seen it. I've been in the civil rights seminars. I've seen in my own class. I've seen that potential, right? And we're getting closer, and our college is closer to the top of the mountain than the other ones. But man, that is a big, big barrier. And of course, you have the mismatch of anthropology, which can be very esoteric to some students, and then intro students. So you've got that mismatch too. So
hey, what are you saying?
Yeah. Hey, I'm just saying what the students say, man.
No, hey.
No, I think you guys are great at that. But you know what I mean? It's tough when people have never been trained to think that way, or their parents weren't professors like mine, where they question everything at the dinner table, right? That is a new thing for them, and it can be so tough for them. And I think these examples of Black Latter-day Saints in particular can be so disarming and just really help bring people. But that's just one example. But there's the less hopeful side too. Okay,
Well,
sorry.
I think it's pretty complicated in that, I mean, I've had a class 2 years ago. I had a very massive class similar to this one. And we had a bunch of students from Africa, and 2 of the students from Africa really helped things go to, I mean, it really jumped the rails, because they started being very vocal about, like, you liberals just want to kill babies, and like they were extremely shameful of LGBT people when we got to the gender and sexuality section. And because they were from Africa, I felt like it actually tamped down pushback, because people were really nervous about engaging that student and those 2 students. And anyway, it actually devolved in one part with an African American student yelling at the 2 African students, calling them racist, and then they just started fighting in the middle of the class. It was nuts. So I mean, I think this stuff gets super sticky.
No, and I'm not trying to say there's a formula, and you and I should definitely talk as well. I've learned a lot over the years. And it's just like, you know, Asian Americans and Asian students, they've had very different experiences, some of them. And now we got all these students that are Black American, but their parents were Black immigrant. And they, you know, it's a lot of things going on there too. So there's a lot of dimensions there. I don't want to oversimplify it. I was just talking about more of the people that were Black American from the legacy of slavery that taught me. But you're absolutely right. And this can go wrong even when we're well prepared, right? It can always be surprising.
I usually also add a conversation.
If I can just add on, because I have to run off.
Go ahead.
So I really appreciate this opportunity to share today. But I think for sure this is a work in progress that we have to continually navigate. And I think that's where, again, trying to understand where our students are coming from can really help, even in our own patients, as we try to do with some of the challenges, but also navigating the intersections of different multiple identities. And I think that's where, even as we use ourselves as an educative tool. So for me, coming as an African student, and I think this is where coming into this country in that channel has helped, even in my own, using my own experience, especially with the question that came in with, you know, racism, and how do we help people understand that? And so being able to latch onto those definitions, how we see it in our field, but also even how the definitions that students are leaning to, what purpose does that serve, right? Like, because we tend to, there's purpose in all the behaviors that we do. Every behavior and ways we see things is fitting some kind of need. So if I'm trying to define racism in a certain way or versus another, so just trying to help them explore those different ways and even how they see it. Why is that more comfortable for you than this definition, right? To kind of help students be able to explore those things, but also recognizing. So for me, this is an area that I've definitely used in the classroom when I have, you know, predominantly, you know, I think I have like 1 Black student in every class, but being able to see where they're coming from, but also use my own experience, because then I came from a place where I didn't have to see myself as a racialized person. So I'm like, you know, I get it, how you don't see this, because I started there, but then being able to latch on my own journey and how I've had to learn and adjust, right? And understand the Black American experience and be able to do that. So I think even on our part, we can be able to latch on, you know, where we were, where we started, and maybe some of the things that have been helpful or unhelpful along the way with this. So I have to run away, but it's been a pleasure to do this. I have to go pick up kids from school. So I'm gonna say goodbye.
Thank you, Sharina.
Thank you. Wonderful contributions. Thank you. DJ, do you have something you wanted to comment? I thought were you getting ready to say something?
Just real quick. It's usually when I talk about race and other issues like this, I don't call it this in class, but it's there's no need for white guilt or male guilt or class guilt kind of conversation in class. And so I basically just gets down to me explaining that, look, the point of analyzing these topics through my subject matter and the point of discussing as a class is to pursue the method of inquiry, right? Is to pursue which is the method of historical work, right? To try to answer questions, to gain a broader perspective, to understand what other people, see, what they've experienced, right, etc. And so in discussing, I just say there's just no room and there's no need for anyone to feel guilty about what we're talking about, what's happened in the past. We can't, do anything about the past. We can only do things about the present. And I share some very personal experiences about that. I'll usually, pull in a kind of gospel tie-in. I mean, I had a really neat kind of like awareness and awakening of this, like sitting in a temple once. And I usually share that experience with them, like dealing with my own family history, right? And considering like what, what my white family members may have done, right? Or what they may have thought and seen when, they were among the first white settlers to enter Arkansas after the removal of the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Creek, etc. Right? Like I have ancestry on that side, right? So I use myself as an example, like how do I deal with that? How do I come to terms with that, right? But to emphasize the point that this is not about promoting shame or name calling. When we use the term race or racism, we are being descriptive of actions. We are not name calling, right? To say someone was, a racist, then we need to, we're going to point to those specific examples, right? And we're not just trying to tarnish a reputation. We're trying to learn from what happened there, right? So that's my contribution. I try to provoke that type of discussion, right? When we feel engaging in a conversation, like all of a sudden we feel defensive, that we should, kind of question that and wonder, what is this? What's making me feel this way? What's making my heart beat faster, right? And pause and take a deeper breath and not just be so reluctant to take offense or so quick to take offense and to discard another perspective, but to analyze why something makes us feel a certain way and try to remove that aspect of, again, guilt and shame. Those are just not effective, and they're huge barriers to our learning.
Yeah. So I think that hearing kind of where our conversations have moved, it does seem like we have to be proactive up front. So some of the things we talked about, what we do at the beginning of the semester, and understanding that most of what we're experiencing from students comes from fear or shame, right? So there's sort of this defensiveness around that because we don't want our core identity to be challenged. So if up front we're communicating things like the idea of a beloved community or other language that we may use to say that, and also taking very seriously some of the ground rules and what's important about them, then that's always a place to go back to. And part of those ground rules tend to be, students think of it, if not, I encourage it, taking responsibility for how we feel. So students can be taught this, like, what does self-reflection look like? What does it mean what am I feeling? Why am I afraid? Like, I love what you said, DJ, why is my heart going faster? And giving them opportunities to develop a level of maturity where they have a little more self-awareness. It's a slightly easier in my field because if you're training as a psychologist, you've got to develop that skill anyway. But I think it's part of professionalism to take responsibility for how we're feeling and kind of work through some of those shame or fear pieces to re-inform them. Sam, I don't know what you're thinking about of when to close things up, but we're a half hour past our original time frame, so I defer to you.
Oh, this has been a great conversation. If there's anything else, we can keep going.